I was recently catching up on all the 2025 films that came out, and there's a couple of movies that really stuck out to me that I just loved, and I was like, why do I love these? What's so good about them? And among other things, I noticed that they had story structure that really stuck with me. That inspired me to look into these types of story structures and really dive into why we like them and how we can be more intentional with how we watch or read stories.
The first that we'll talk about is modular story structure or episodic story structure. The easiest way to think about the modular narrative is it's many small arcs within one large arc. And each of these arcs have their own setup and conflict and resolution, and there's small changes from each of the arcs that compounds over and over again until the large climax by the end of the full arc. Lots of stories use this structure, from classics like Don Quixote to more recent novels like Sapkowski's Witcher novels. Matt Dinniman's Dungeon Crawler Carl uses this. TV shows use this a lot, like Breaking Bad and Supernatural. And it works so well with TV because singular episodes can have their singular arcs, but then also have one overarching thread that pushes you through the entire story. One of the interesting things about modular story structure is by the end of each episode, you are usually leaving those problems in those side characters behind. And the only thing that's changing are the main characters. Some of the downsides of this story structure that you have to be really careful with, though, if the arcs don't have change from each singular one that happens, your story then just becomes a sitcom like Friends, where everything is reset at the end of each episode. Be careful not to do this because it can be very stagnating really quickly. You have to make sure that there are scars continuing to build until this massive moment at the end. That's what gives this so much strength. You have to make sure that things are changing and things are progressing.
So Jesse mentioned Breaking Bad, and I really want to jump over to the Fichtean Curve, which is something that I've been exploring, and something that Breaking Bad actually does really well. If you zoom out from the episodic nature, you'll see that Breaking Bad has this rising tension to it, and that's what the Fichtean Curve is. There are spikes in the narrative, and almost like miniature climaxes that continually raise the stakes. You basically have this unrelenting rising tension. It opens with some problem the characters have, and so with every solution the characters try to come up with, it just gets worse and worse, and that's what actually rises those stakes. And even the ending typically doesn't resolve, it's more ambiguous. The movie Hereditary is, I think, my quintessential example of the Fichtean Curve. It opens with the death of the matriarch of the family, and you'll have this unrelenting tension that continually rises and rises, and it even ends with a rather ambiguous plot point. Another movie that does this really well is Prisoners. There really isn't a climax, it just continually gets more and more pressure. Even its ending, it feels a bit ambiguous. It tries to make a bit of a closing statement, and then One Battle After Another and Marty Supreme, those two, same thing. They have this really good pacing of tension and conflict throughout their narrative. Something that Marty Supreme did that was so interesting was it took what would have been a climax in other movies and it just counted it as another beat, something that the movie seemed to be building towards. It hit it really early in its runtime, and then it just upped the stakes, and it has another climax that it gets to towards the end of the film.
The next story structure that I'm going to be talking about was coined by Robert McKee as progressive complications, but I like to just call it yes but no and. At its simplest, yes but no and is like a rule of improv, basically. Whenever you are facing something in your story, you will ask yourself, do my characters solve this problem? If you say yes, you will add a but. Something else will change. And if you say no, you will say and. Something is added to it. This pushes you to always be increasing stakes no matter what is happening. Andy Weir uses it, Joe Abercrombie uses it, but one of the easiest ways to look at it is the recent D&D movie. As an example, we start with the inciting incident. The protagonist's wife dies. He tries to get a scroll of revival. Does he succeed? No. And then he's imprisoned. He tries to escape prison. Does he succeed? Yes. But he learns his old group has disbanded. He tries to get his band back together. Does he succeed? Yes. But he learns one of them betrayed him and stole the scroll of revival. And this continues and continues and continues, constantly adding stakes until you get to the climax where you have this massive moment. And by the end, you have one final yes or no with no and or but. Now, one of the things that I think you need to be careful with this story structure is making sure that your no's and yeses are tied to character flaws or character competency rather than just random things that you're adding for the sake of no reason. There is a term called Deus Ex Wrench, just like Deus Ex Machina, where the author will save their characters. Deus Ex Wrench is you throw throw in problems that have no real meaning. They're just kind of there to add fake stakes. Because you are constantly adding stakes, you need to make sure that they work within the context of your story and with the context of what your character would feasibly fail or succeed at. Otherwise, it feels very fake. One of its benefits is how much freedom it gives you. You can have stories as different as Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. That's a very optimistic and fun story. The story has more yes buts than it does no ands. Or you can have a very pessimistic dark story like Joe Abercrombie's Blade itself, where it's mostly no ands. Being along that spectrum allows you to choose the tone of your story and how much you want your characters to succeed or fail.
The other story structure that I was looking at is called Freytag's Pyramid, or also called the technique of the drama. This is basically a slightly more complicated version of just like a 3-act structure. You essentially have exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and the resolution. You typically have a slow build, and you will introduce an early climax rather than the midpoint or a little later as a traditional story would go. As the story has the falling action, there's an inevitability to that falling action and then the resolution. It'll also explore more naturally character transformations. So it could be typically, more of a character focused type story. The prime example that I found here was The Dark Knight. But since it's a sequel, it just sort of drops you in and it makes you think that it's going to be something like the Fichtean Curve. It's just a tense ride, opening with the Joker, but you'll see that it actually introduces a really big climax. It's the fairy dilemma climax where Joker presents the problem for Batman on who to save. And so that's essentially opens up that inevitability that will then fall. Another really good example is The Hunger Games. The games become the climax or that center point where you have the rising action that naturally flows. It starts with Katniss and the world building, and it'll rise and then it'll fall with the repercussions of after the games. And what's interesting here is there are some books and movies that will kind of flow between story structures. Gone Girl is a really good example of this because it seems like it's going to be more on this Fichtean Curve side where there's a rising tension, but it actually introduces this really big climax towards the middle and completely genre twist as well. So it goes from like a mystery to this thriller type. The same can be said for something like The Road if you've read McCarthy's work. And then Parasite as well is a really good example of something that kind of twists the genre where it starts pretty normal as this satire type story, and then there's a reveal close to the midpoint. There's a basement scene and it just totally twists the narrative.
I think a lot of writers have hesitation when it comes to story structure because a lot of authors feel it puts bounds on their creativity. I want to assure people that these story structures are just tools at the end of the day. And I mean that on both ends of the conversation. On one end, don't think that this tool is going to in some way compromise your creativity because you're using something that is not specifically just your imagination. At the end of the day, it's just a tool. It has no power over your story. If it doesn't work, throw it out. But at the same time, do not feel slavish to these structures because, again, they are tools.
I don't think you need to follow these precisely. I think it is really beneficial to analyze as you're watching or reading stories to really investigate, why do I like this, or why is this popular? Some of the structures, they go back to Aristotle's time where he tried to figure out what people like to consume. What I like to do is to just consume as I would and be more intentional with trying to figure out what these structures are so I can enter them into my subconscious essentially. So when I go to write, some of these things, they come out more naturally. I don't have to think about them and force myself into a certain structure or type. So that's the reason I think it's beneficial. It's not something you need to rigidly stick to, but it's something that could be really helpful in determining what people like, what you like, and then to follow that suit. So that'll about do it from us. If there are certain structures you like, let us know, and ones that we didn't talk about, and we'd love to dive in and have a discussion with you all. So that'll about do it from us. See ya.
Hey guys, if you really like this video, check the one down below. You might like that one too.
And if you really like what you see, click here to subscribe.